basically a professor hands us a tray of leaves, and goes, these are the therapies. This is psychotherapy. Psychotherapy is a tray of leaves, and pick which leaf you like the most, and then that's the one that you'll do your whole life. I'm Glenn Wood.
And I'm Richard Tadamir.
We're psychotherapists based out of British Columbia, Canada, and you're listening to Deliberating Practice.
In this podcast, we deconstruct everything from the foundations of therapy to its newest innovations and horizons.
We take a critical perspective on contemporary issues that affect therapists across the world. We share our own stories, both personal and professional, and sometimes we talk to other therapists too.
We hope that this podcast can be like sitting with the trusted mentor you always wish you had, helping you integrate and make sense of our complex and exciting field.
So sit back, relax, and enjoy the episode. For resources, show notes, and to work with Richard or Glenn for supervision, consulting, or counseling, go to deliberatingpractice.com.
Hi, I'm Richard Tadamir, and this is the Deliberating Practice podcast. I'm joined, as always, by the wonderful Glenn Wood. Glenn, how are you doing?
Oh, Richard, I love that you called me wonderful. I'm doing well tonight. How are you doing?
I'm doing good.
That's awesome, Richard. Good to be here with you tonight again for another episode.
Good to see you too.
Yeah. This is an exciting episode. This is our 10th episode, and given that we live in a base 10 culture, 10 is a big deal. It's worth celebrating just that we've made it to 10 episodes. That's an accomplishment in and of itself. But we have a pretty exciting and special episode planned for our listeners tonight. And so why don't I just jump in and...
Please do.
Yeah, get us going and sort of introducing what we're going to be talking about tonight. What Richard and I are appreciating and wanting to be more explicit about is that a lot of the positions and the perspectives that we take in our episodes have a connection to kind of a burgeoning discipline within psychotherapy, which is critical psychotherapy. Critical psychotherapy being this sort of subdiscipline of psychotherapy that critiques the practice of psychotherapy, that takes a critical or deconstructive stance to the practice of psychotherapy. So we thought it would be really great for our 10th episode to actually engage around some of the literature that exists, around critical psychotherapy, which is not extensive, but there certainly are authors and professors and researchers who are engaged in the process of critical psychotherapy, critical engagement with psychotherapy. And so tonight we're going to be talking about maybe one of the main figures in the world of critical psychotherapy, although probably an author that none of our listeners will have ever heard of, and certainly I had never heard of him before, taking on an explicit exploration of critical psychotherapy and developing this episode with Richard. But we're going to be talking about the work and the perspective of professor of counseling and psychotherapy at the University of Roehampton in the UK, Del Loewenthal. And so Del is a chartered counseling psychologist in the UK. He trained at the Philadelphia Association in London, and some of you might know, this is something I've learned not too long ago, but the Philadelphia Association is, despite the name being Philadelphia, it's an association and movement that was developed by R.D. Lang, or Ronald Lang, who was a Scottish psychiatrist, anti-psychiatrist, critical psychotherapist himself, and which remains, a sort of bastion of critical and deconstructive thought, existential thought in the UK in psychotherapy. Del is an analytical psychotherapist and existential analytical psychotherapist, and most importantly, a critical psychotherapist, and like a super prolific writer. Like Richard, when we were looking him up, it was like the guy's written like 20 or something books. Like it's crazy how much he's written. But the piece that we're going to be focusing on tonight is called Critical Psychotherapy, Psychoanalysis, and Counseling, Implications for Practice. And despite the fact that we've just introduced the book, we're not actually going to be covering the entire book, because that was originally what Richard and I tried to do, and we recorded a whole episode, and it just didn't make sense, because the book, it's not actually entirely the thinking of Del Loewenthal. It's a collection of essays from a wide variety of figures from all sorts of disciplines centered around the topic of critical psychotherapy, which Del has compiled and edited, and he contributed the introductory chapter to. And so we found, as we were talking about and trying to make sense of this complex book so that it was just too big for a single episode. It just wasn't going to work, right? Yeah. And so we came back and decided, okay, well, why don't we just talk about Dell's essay in the book? Because Dell himself, he wrote, I think, a great introductory essay where he sort of spells out the logic of critical psychotherapy and tries to make a case, at least provides his perspective on what critical psychotherapy could be. And I think he said some really interesting things that are worth talking about. So Richard and I, we're going to talk about it tonight, aren't we, Richard? We're going to sort of go through the article and some of Dell's thinking and have a chat about it and see where it takes us.
We're going to attempt to explain the unexplainable of critical psychotherapy.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. It's because it's not, I think good to sort of acknowledge for our listeners, critical psychotherapy, it's not like a unified, discipline or anything like that. It's, kind of like, Dell's book here. It's a collection of thoughts and perspectives. There's authors from diverse disciplines inside and outside of the world of psychotherapy and psychology who contribute and sort of provide their perspective on what could be sort of wrong with psychotherapy or where psychotherapy needs to steer itself. We're not advancing like a single position. We're just going to talk about what Dell thinks tonight. And then my hope is that we'll come back to this book and touch on essays again, different essays from other authors, because there's some really amazing essays in that book. In other episodes. So we'll do maybe a series of episodes around this particular book, or maybe some of Dell's work or some of the other big authors like Colin Feltham and Ian Parker, Mari Rudy, things like that. So that's the hope. But yeah, why don't we dive right in and sort of get going on Dell here and give our listeners a sense of what Dell's all about. So I'll start us off by, I guess, talking about my sense of Dell's sort of immediate thesis in this article, which he's just trying to explain and make the case for whether or not and why we would need a critical psychotherapy. So, while it's difficult to describe exactly what a critical psychotherapy is, generally it's the idea that we would have some issue with the way psychotherapy is done in sort of the status quo fashion, right? Or there'd be some concern about the practice of psychotherapy that would warrant criticism. And so, we might take a critical stance. We might say, hey, there's something wrong there, right? I think I gave the definition of, I think critical psychotherapy is the branch of psychotherapy that is concerned with attacking itself, and that's my perspective on things. But Dell takes the position that why we need a critical psychotherapy is because, or would be because I think that he does a lovely job of sort of writing this article in a bit of a speculative fashion, just sort of going, this is an open question. This is, we're sort of asking ourselves, is there a need for critical psychotherapy? And he sort of offers his thoughts, but it's left as a question, which I think is a lovely way to retain engagement around the issue, right? But he asserts that psychology and psychiatry, so not psychotherapy itself, but say the study of psychology, the academic or experimental study of psychology, and then the medical practice of psychiatry, he asserts that these are primarily agents of the state, and that it is possible that psychotherapy is becoming an agent of the state as well. And this would be the space that Dell would want to engage critically with psychotherapy, as well as psychology and psychiatry, is that there would be a need for criticism when something becomes an agent of the state. And so I think that that's really interesting, and maybe we just start there, Richard, and I sort of want to get your thoughts on, what do you think about this idea of psychotherapy as an agent of the state, or,
Yeah, I think it connects to the previous podcast on Cushman, and we'll get more into that element that therapy is a cultural artifact, right? It's reflective of the culture that we're in. It varies between cultures. It's not this, it's not as maybe scientific as the gospel as much as people or psychologists would like to position or have perhaps in the past, or society, the medical field would like to. So, I do agree with Dell's point. I think it's being increasingly captured by the state, as well as, the state, right, is captured by private corporations and private interests. So I think we can't disconnect the two in a neoliberal capitalistic society.
Well said. Well said. Yeah, he focuses on this idea of audit culture, which I think is really interesting. And it's not a concept I had really come up against until reading his article. But I think that that's what you're speaking to, Richard, is that psychotherapy is captured by the state, and it's captured through this audit culture. Audit culture being the sort of culture of management that we have around services or programs provided by the state, which is that there's normally a manager that provides some type of oversight. Typically, they're not someone who's in the a role where they provide the service, but they kind of stand outside of the service and they audit it and that they ensure that it's meeting a kind of standard. And our psychotherapy maybe used to be something that was conducted primarily in sort of the private sphere. It used to be something that was sort of part of the civil society, right? Like it was just something that was done. People did it, and the state had no stake or involvement. The state wasn't really involved. But now, Dell's sort of position, especially in the UK, is that psychotherapy is increasingly provided by the state and managed by the state. And as such, the state has extended itself into the space of psychotherapy and exerts tremendous influence over it. So I thought that was interesting. And I sort of see a parallel in BC, just in the fact that we do have public programs that provide psychotherapy services and that I think are subject to this kind of audit culture too, right? I know I work for a publicly funded, we don't necessarily provide psychotherapy explicitly, but like a publicly funded service, right? And there is a kind of, there is a sort of structure around our program, and we're supposed to kind of meet a specific set of standards or a kind of mandate around our program. And, while our program's a little bit more flexible, I understand that one of the criticisms, for instance, in some of the publicly funded programs across BC is that, they're kind of reductive to a certain type of psychotherapy. There's not a lot of flexibility around how practitioners can engage with their patients. There's an emphasis on cost effectiveness. We could say that, right? Yeah. That sort of being a constant feature of how the service is structured, which would not necessarily be the case in civil society, right? So yeah, I want to sort of pass it back to you, Richard, because I feel like I'm hogging the mic here. Those are just some of the places I'm going as we talk about audit culture and the influence of the state, this idea that the state could somehow be involved in psychotherapy.
Yeah, I agree on those points. Having worked in the past in the Ministry of Children and Family, which is the child welfare system, family and child welfare system in BC. It's very colonized. There's absolutely initiatives and wonderful people that are challenging that and attempting to decolonize, but it's still very colonized. And I remember it was a colleague or a supervisor, a clinician was saying, I can't remember who, but they were saying that, and this was early on, kind of getting my initiation almost into this particular culture. And I was asking him like, oh, well, I'm learning about a lot of other theories in school than CBT. In fact, I'm really finding a lot of value in getting connected to the body and somatic experiencing and even EMDR, which at this point, now that was probably about 7 years ago, like the amount of evidence, if we're just looking even at just Western evidence, is really, really strong on it. But it was still considered, at least in terms of that government structure, pretty woo-woo, I guess. And he was saying to me that, this is paid by the taxpayers. The taxpayers expect that it is evidence-based and that they should be able to see that, there's evidence-based means peer-reviewed journals. This is what it means. And a very medicalized view, right? He didn't necessarily agree with this view or that this was right, but he was very blunt in saying, this is why the way it is. Absolutely the cost effectiveness portion, but that the common belief, perhaps the status quo or the current paradigm, right? To borrow from Thomas Kuhn and the process, right, of scientific revolution, the current paradigm is of a particular way of understanding what is evidence-based, and that means we need to do CBT. He's like, when you're in your own office and you're doing, therapy, you probably are going to do different things, but in your notes and in what you are kind of what in the way that we explain it to the public and the programs that we feature, it's CBT. So there's one example.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's helpful or not.
No, that's really good. That's really, really good. I so appreciate that sort of personal example. Because I know you've been inside, some of these programs that are a little bit more structured around a particular modality, right? Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, I'm going to trail off a little bit, but I think, at our program, we're having a bit of an interesting experience where I would say that predominantly the counselors that I work with are humanists, and most of us work in a kind of humanistic, person-centered, supportive way, and we work around the experience of cancer. And so we're all sort of working in a way where we're trying to build an understanding of our clients and just working around their particular set of concerns and often around grief. And so there's a very process-oriented way that I think most of us engage. But we sort of share, or we have some oversight provided by psychiatry. I think provincially our program is run by psychiatrists, by us psychiatrists. And there are psychiatrists that work alongside us at BC Cancer. And it's interesting to sort of see their interest and their investment in the work that we do, or their understanding of the work that we do, because, they think about things primarily through the medical model, right? And so they're, for instance, interested in trying to develop a CBT skills group specifically for cancer patients, which I think is kind of interesting, right? Because most of us know that there's actually or at least there is some evidence base to support CBT in a psychosocial oncology base, but I think most of us, we don't necessarily, I don't lean in that way, but I think a lot of us don't necessarily lean right to CBT as sort of a first line option for people who are experiencing cancer, if it fits their concerns or matches their interests, perhaps. But often we would want to take a little bit more of a broader stance, maybe a more existential stance in how we engage with our patients. I think it's sort of interesting how I feel like we have a really good read on our patients, and I think we provide a really good service that sort of matches them, but there's sort of this constant looming threat of, psychiatry's influence in our space that we have to be wary of. And so far it hasn't colonized it, but I worry that might come, right? I worry that might come because of this sort of culture of psychotherapy, because of the state's influence of the culture of psychotherapy.
That's a fair worry, I think.
Yeah. And I mean, we've taken on the problems around the evidence-based, sort of movement, right? And the culture of evidence-based practice in psychotherapy. And that's to say that Richard and I are not against evidence or not sort of anti-evidence, but we're sort of the position, perhaps similar to Jonathan Shedler, just that the way that we derive our evidence is really important, or what evidence we base our positioning on is really important. And if the conclusions drawn from randomized clinical controlled trials of 8 to 16 sessions of a manualized therapy just aren't really applicable to psychotherapy in the wild, right? And I think none of those, maybe very few of those orientations predicate themselves on, what I would say is this idea of developing an understanding of the patient, right? Like most of them work from a generalized explanation of behavior, and they derive their corpus of interventions from this generalized explanation of what's going on. They don't try to derive an understanding of the person first, and then move towards interventions from that place of understanding. Now, that's kind of a controversial thing I've said. I'm sure that if there's pro-CBT people out there who are understanding counselors, they're going to dunk all over me. But I think that's, there's some merit to what I'm saying, right? Especially in the sort of the research field and in the practice of manualization, because I think that when you manualize a therapy, you're by nature removing the possibility for developing an understanding. I think I've gone on a tangent.
You might have. I also would ask, what is developing an understanding even, right? It depends on how far you want to go into it, Glenn, or not.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm using the word developing an understanding explicitly tonight because there's another sort of place in our reading of Dale Loewenthal where I think that that's going to make more sense. So maybe I'll come back to it. But I feel like I want to say one more thing about the state's influence in psychotherapy, which is just that I think that even if we accept the logic of the evidence-based movement, and because I think what your supervisor said made a lot of sense, right? That when the state takes on the responsibility for providing psychotherapy, it does have to consider cost effectiveness as a variable, right? And it does have to look to the available body of evidence to try to find the best possible service to meet the needs of the people that it serves, right? I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I think that's sort of a wonderful sentiment, right? So, but I think even if we accept that, I feel that there is another way that the state influences the practice of psychotherapy, and that is kind of in the more basic way that it premises psychotherapy, which is sort of going back to Cushman, but kind of the idea of just like psychotherapy is still sort of reproductive of the status quo, right? So we're back to the idea that, like even if we accept the logic of the evidence-based position, right, which I think is fine, we're still in this position of we understand psychotherapy primarily as providing something to fill a hole, psychotherapy as a product or a commodity that can be consumed, right? People go to psychotherapists for skills, for instruction, around certain interventions. They don't necessarily go to psychotherapists for a self-understanding. They don't necessarily go to psychotherapists to be related to well. So that's my take is that I think there's another way that the state is operative, and that's just in this whole notion of the commodification of psychotherapy and psychotherapy as a product of consumption.
Maybe another way of saying that is, in the cases where the state is paying for, or it may not always be paying for, right? It could be dictating standards. We'll maybe talk a little bit about regulation. It's, how do I want to say this? It's purchasing a toolbox, right? So in this state controlled, it's purchasing a toolbox to repair broken people. And by broken, it may mean, almost by definition of living in a capitalist culture, the person isn't working. They're not functional enough to the standard of a neoliberal capitalist standard, right? So maybe the youth is not going to school enough. That's often an area where then, oh, okay, we need to get this kid into child and youth mental health, right? So there's a problem, right? They're not fitting into the system. It's very rarely, at least on the referral, is it that, well, maybe the system isn't fitting the child or the patient, right? Maybe working 5 days a week is not always sustainable for everybody, especially when you look at intersections of disability or other pieces like this. So, but it's the idea that the person is not functioning. They're, as you mentioned in the notes here, they deviate from what is considered the state's view of optimal, or society's view at that time of optimal functioning.
I love that. Yeah, that's so good and so true. Yeah. That psychotherapy is a normalizing force. It's a way of correcting a deviation, bringing someone back into line. Yeah. It always makes me sad when I meet patients who have that internalized, and they come to see me and they're like, I just want to get checked out. I just want to make sure I'm normal.
And what if being normal is actually the most mad, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Or what does Foucault and so many of the philosophers say, right? To be mad in a society that is ill, may be the most health. Yeah. Something along those lines. Yeah.
Or for me, it's like just sad that it's more important to be normal than to be oneself.
Yes. Well said. Yeah.
Yeah. That is the position that they've taken in, that conformity
I'll sacrifice myself. I'll sacrifice my identity. I'll sacrifice my relationships potentially, or my internal self, my communal self, at the altar of capitalism and normalcy, whatever that is.
Yeah. It is. Yeah. Yeah, well, so I think we've done a good job of sort of touching on that idea of just, okay, I think it makes sense that the state has some influence on the provision of psychotherapy in our modern era. And I guess maybe one more point just to hand over to listeners before we move on to, an additional, piece of Loewenthal is just that for him, he's really writing around this relatively modern, although I think this book came out, 14 years ago now. And so, it's maybe not so modern anymore, but this relatively modern movement that was happening in the UK called the Increasing Access to Psychological Therapies, IAPT, which was something that happened in the UK. And it was a movement primarily to expand accessibility in the realm of psychotherapy. And that meant the NHS taking on an increasing amount of the provision of psychotherapy, primarily in sort of the short form solution focused and manualized therapies. And so Dell's really writing around that, the double-edged sword of that. It's like, it's great that psychotherapy is more accessible, but also for him, there's this sense of, but psychotherapy has changed as a result of that, right? And it's become primarily the practice of taking people's minds off of their problems as opposed to helping people work through their problems and engage with them constructively, right? So that's his take. But I'd never heard of IAP before, so I just wanted to make sure our listeners are aware of that too, and that you might look into it more as a sort of interesting site of the increasing publicization of psychotherapy. I don't know if that's the right word for it, as opposed to privatization, publicization. Yeah.
So another take that I have is that Dell is kind of presenting, or for me, I got the sense of a choice being presented in our field and maybe in society as well in general, and certainly a choice for us as therapists, because he's really, writing to therapists. I don't think the layperson walking across the street is going to pick up, the book Critical Psychotherapy in most cases. So we have this burden of trying to reform or tear down, or whatever you want to say, innovate, revolutionize the system, and certainly be aware of its issues. And so I see this choice point of, are we collaborators? So do we kind of actively join the state in, okay, well, this is increasing access to psychological therapy, I guess, and this is cost effective, and should we just kind of settle right in there and join in the party, so to speak? Or are we resistors? No, not over my dead body. Will, I allow this? Will I protest this in various ways, or not comply? So whether, any of those actions, that could mean our job, the end of a position, a job, a program, any number of things. But anyway, collaboration, maybe one stance. Resistance is another stance. Another stance that I thought about is insurgency. So this idea of kind of like, I'm going to be on the inside and study what is going on, and maybe being able to speak against it at certain ways, or use my influence to shape in maybe subtle ways. When I think about insurgency, maybe there's other times where I reveal myself, but these are some of the positions perhaps that we need to think about, right? Critical psychotherapy, I think, is a radical position. It has risks. I think it has risks personally. Yeah, perhaps otherwise as well, right? Like, there was a reason why I don't work for Ministry of Children and Family anymore. It's kind of a self-selection out, in a sense, is I couldn't kind of toe the line around some of these ideas that we're discussing. I love this quote by Dell. The talking therapies are in a climate of increasing state-regulated practice, with its growth of manualization, the training of technicians, and approaches that favor taking clients' minds off their concerns. I want to emphasize that perhaps neoliberalism and the state's continued increasing capture of psychotherapy might be transforming us from healers into technicians. So that's my hot take.
I really like that, Richard. I'm sort of hearing it as the idea that, like, this is happening whether we're aware of it or not. And certainly there's something to be said about the need to make people aware, right? Or even just like for people to appreciate, what is happening, right? But regardless, all of us are sort of forced to make a decision, to take a stand, in the face of this. Where do we stand in this, right? Do we placate the state and become technicians and sort of reduce ourselves and the practice of psychotherapy down to something that serves its interests? Or do we retain a sense of who we are against immense pressure, right? In order to provide, the kind of service that we feel is meaningful or valuable to ourselves and to the people we worked with. So yeah. And we're sort of in true existential fashion, to not choose is still to choose, right? Like, there's no...
Yes, Alan Watts would also talk about the game. The game is being played, whether we like it or not. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think our listeners probably get a sense of where Richard and I stand on
Are we that
on this issue.
Yeah. Hopefully we are.
Obviously collaborators, right? Like, obviously, the most... this is a great time to announce our new manualized therapy. Oh, yeah. I used to have a joke in grad school, Richard. I'm just going to do this little because it's fun. Because I just found like manualized and short-term therapy is kind of absurd, and like so did like everyone I went to school with. Like, so many of us we just found solution-focused therapy so dumb. So I came up with my own, and I called it gaslight therapy. And it's a 2-session therapy. Curious. Okay. It's a 2-session therapy. Yeah. It's like one of the shortest types of therapy that you can do. And essentially in the first session, you just sort of do a really good job of listening to the patient and developing a collaborative relationship with them, and, just validating and taking their problems seriously so that they feel this real sense of, connection to you and trust, and, like they want you to be their therapist, and a little bit of a sense of hope that something is going to be, going to happen in the therapy. And then in the second session, when they start to talk about their problems again, you go, oh, that's interesting. I don't remember you talking about that last time. And then you gaslight them into being happy. You say, actually, I remember that you were feeling really, really good in our last session. And actually, you're fine. And everything's good. And you just spend the whole session laying on the gaslighting, and then people leave going, oh, I guess I'm okay.
Well, and then from an evidence base, we'd say, oh, maybe they didn't come back. They must be healed.
Yeah. Yeah. There you go. Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, obviously, there's not real. I'm not a gaslight therapist, but I just, there are some therapies that are a little bit like that, right? Maybe I was calling out certain therapies for being a little bit gaslighty. But oh no, where was I going? I lost this. I was,
Yeah, I wanted to jump in for a second too and just mention, like, I don't think, Glenn, you or I we're against standards, right? That's different.
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
I think standards, having values-based therapy, important. I'm involved in research and training to train therapists and also non-therapists, youth workers, etc., in basically client-centered, therapy, micro skills. Some of that's described by Gerard Egan. So that's empathic listening, reflection, probing, all these different stuff that are great for communication and can be really helpful. I think it's the and even myself, I use CBT techniques on occasion, but it's within a much larger and open-minded paradigm. And I know that Western evidence is one form, one way of knowing, but I also work closely with Indigenous communities. There are so many other ways of knowing, the somatic way of knowing, Indigenous ways of knowing. They had medicines, right? They know the medicines within the earth, and that's been carried on for hundreds or thousands of years. So there's other ways of knowing that are just as valid. So it's the privileging, I think, of the Western manualized evidence-based way of knowing above everything else is my big problem.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. Like, I think there has to be standards, and I think that our governing bodies have pretty good standards, right? And I have no issue with that, right? Or that, as practitioners, we work to try to meet those standards. But yeah, it is more for me the idea of manualization. It's the idea that you could take out the process of understanding from psychotherapy and just create a prescriptive process in its place that's supposed to function the same for everyone. This is what troubles me, right? That psychotherapy no longer is a human to human process.
That it could be done by an AI, right? Following an algorithm.
Exactly. Yeah.
It doesn't recognize the uniqueness of human nature.
Yeah. And that there isn't an emphasis on individual understanding. If it's good for the population that it was demonstrated effective on, it's good for you too, right?
And if you don't fit into that, there must be a problem with you.
Yeah. I think I've tried to talk around this issue before, and it seems just worth it bringing it up again in tonight's episode a little bit. Just like this is reflective of not just a problem in psychotherapy, but in all of academic and psychological science, that we are trying to derive a set of general principles that have explanatory power in people's behavior, but because our behavior is so contextual, it's not actually possible to derive a set of general principles that explain this or that person's behavior. And so I don't know, like when I was doing my undergrad, I found so many of the courses that I took like extremely frustrating, like social psychology as an example, or cognitive psychology, things like that, because I was sort of being told that certain things were true for me based off of studies that were conducted in laboratories, somewhere in the United States on undergrads or something like that. And it's not that they weren't true for me. It's not that like nothing was being captured in this research, but it was just that this research, it had limited explanatory power because it wasn't considering people in context, right? Like most academic and I think experimental psychological research, even into this day, is still very general in its approach, right? And the assumption is that context doesn't matter, right? The assumption is that like what matters is essentially behavioral principles, right? Like is operant or classical conditioning going on, or like context is seen as noise, right? Like it's seen as something that needs to be isolated so that we can have a pure sense of the psychological mechanism that is at play, right? But I think it's important to acknowledge that we can't extrapolate context from our understanding of human psychology.
Yeah.
And the quote that I often go to is a quote from Gordon Allport, who was president of the American Psychological Association back in the 50s and the 60s, I think. He was a personality psychologist. And he said, maybe the only, I'm going to butcher the quote, but maybe the only thing that is things that are true for everyone are the things that make us different. Or maybe the only things that are the same for all of us are the things that make us different. He was a big advocate of like, there's no person in personality psychology, right? Like we've conducted our research in such a way that we've eliminated anything that makes people unique, right? Like that makes them the person that they are. So I don't know.
It's interesting it's a good point. It's interesting too that even being, having a background in academia and still having one foot in that world as a PhD student, like the evidence-based kind of traditional psychology world, it's now having trouble, right? It's in the sense of applying, right, the generalizable principles or interventions, let's say particular CBT interventions. They're seeing, okay, we're going to now try to apply it because that's the demand. Unfortunately, that's a good challenge of like, oh, okay, there's different people coming into therapy than before, more non-white people coming in of different ages, different intersectionalities, not straight, etc. Okay, so it's a more diverse population. And now trying to apply that, like thinking about even Indigenous populations, applying some CBT manual kind of treatment that was working maybe, okay with youth even at risk, white youth kind of at risk somewhere, and trying to apply that. and it just miserably failing, like actually making the participants in the study worse, right? And like the clinical psychologists or experimental psychologists kind of like scratching their heads like, I don't understand, right? Oh, it must have been a problem of, because I'll hear this in some lectures, it must have been a problem of the it's like the definition of insanity sometimes. It wasn't controlled enough. We didn't try to control enough variables, or the person carrying out the manualization didn't have enough fidelity to the model. And I'm wringing my head and thinking like, no, you do not understand. The context is actually in the strict manualization of CBT. And I think CBT or elements of CBT, and I again use it with Indigenous, can be used really well from a two-eyed, seeing, respectful of Indigenous model. We're including smudging, we're including lots of different things that are whatever is relevant to the community and to the person that is in front of me, what they need. But when you don't do that, now you've literally offended an individual or a group of person, and in fact, maybe even damaged them. So I wanted to give a very clear example.
Yeah, I love that. Makes so much sense. When we think about working with Indigenous people, if we take context seriously, you and I both know you can't understand Indigenous mental health outside of the context of colonization, right? Like a mental health model that doesn't factor in the experience of colonization and intergenerational trauma can't make and won't make sense to Indigenous people.
And certainly
people,
that's
right?
not in the manual. It's not in the introduction of the manual. Let's go into colonization and describe the damages and the elements of that, and like take responsibility. That's right. Seemed to be missing from the manual.
That's right. Well, and that's because context doesn't matter in the when developing manualized therapies. Context is noise, right? It's a factor. We're trying to get to something pure and universal. The psychological principle, or psychological mechanism that structures depression, and that mechanism's not variable. It would be something that's consistent. So it would be like a biological mechanism, or it would be like a psychological mechanism that is acontextual, like an operant or classical conditioning, right? Like something where we don't have to think about factors beyond what is easily reducible and easily reducible, I guess, and universally applicable. Yeah. But of course, you and I know, right? Like when you actually meet people, there isn't like what drives, people's experience is not something universal. Like, yeah, there's similarities. Like, I can meet two patients and see similarities, but everyone's experience is different because everyone's life and context is different, and what's applicable to them and what makes sense to them, what drives their experience, what drives their suffering is different. And so we need understanding in our psychotherapy, right? We need understanding to be at the forefront of our psychotherapy, at the center of our psychotherapy. So I think that's what we're just, adding on to what you said. That's where I have a gripe, right? Yeah. But yeah,
sounds like we're two griping old men here.
Yeah, no kidding. But we're talking about the decision point, right? We're talking about the decision point. We got lost. But it is. I think it's like the decision point. I love that, Richard. I think it's so good, right? I think for me, what I get troubled by is that I think that people don't even know this is happening because there's a whole new, even for many years, this has been going on. And there's, psychotherapists, we're not trained to take a critical position. We don't have, a critical perspective implemented into our education. At least most of us don't. And so, we're not even able to take a critical position or even understand that there's something that is worth criticism going on. I mean, how many of us,
or at least it's either not present or it doesn't go far enough, or again, it's missing the deeper context. Yeah, it's kind of given a surface level attention. Of course, it's going to vary between faculty and program, right? Sometimes we get very lucky and get someone who's very critical. I think you had some in your program at UNBC that were maybe leaning more that way. But, talking about standard, well, that should be a standard, right? A standard of we need built into even like the CCPA competencies to think about, there's standards around what is good multicultural counseling, what is important competencies of working with Indigenous groups. Well, I think more and more that should also include, let's take even a wider critical view of that. Therapy itself, psychology itself has some major inherent flaws.
Yeah, I think what's indicated is a meta theory, right? Is theories about theories, or being able to talk about theory at a meta level, right? So not talking about any one particular theory, but talking about theories in general.
Well said.
Yeah, and we don't do that. We don't think about psychotherapy meta-theoretically. We think about it modally. We think about it this therapy versus that therapy. And Dale touches on this. Why don't we dive into that a little bit? We're sort of
Let's
moving
go
into education
into it.
anyway. Yeah. Yeah. Which is just that like there are real problems with the way that therapists are educated nowadays that sort of, I guess, make criticism difficult or inhibit the possibility of a critical psychotherapy. And one of them is just that we're not taught psychotherapy in sort of a general way and a meta-theoretical way. We're taught to align around particular thought leaders or gurus and to sort of adopt or take in their theory of therapy and work within that paradigm. If you think about it, like you meet a therapist and one of the first questions you want to know is, so, what modalities do you use? How do you practice, right? And that's because we only really understand our discipline modally, right? In terms of these discrete little sort of schools of thought, right? It would be odd for someone to just say, I don't know. I just do whatever, right? But my argument, hot take here, Richard, here you go. I actually think that that's indicated, and that maybe saying, I don't know, is kind of legit. Like, this is what my wife used to do, when we were in grad school together, is I would be, spouting off about this or that theory or whatever, and she would just go, I don't know. Like, I just sort of listen. I don't even know what I do. I don't like it. She would say, I don't like it. And she was onto something. She was totally onto something, which is that the way that we learn about psychotherapy is really dumb. We don't learn sort of general principles about psychotherapy. There isn't sort of like a broad understanding of the discipline as a whole. We just,
its origins and roots are missing, right? Few people take a philosophy of psychology. I've had the chance to take at least one course like that. Oh my gosh, it was eye-opening to see the roots of psychology and some pretty scary roots, including in eugenics, definitely in colonization, all the way back into Greece, right? There's some wonderful and helpful aspects, from philosophy, Stoicism, etc. Stoicism could be looked at, there's elements of thought challenging in there, critical thinking, but also how it was used as a tool to control people or reduce people's power, limit them, say what is, perfect in the standard and who is not, exclude them. So that is very helpful. I think really all programs, I love what you're saying, the meta theory should include the context of history, Western history, indigenous history, world history, cultural religious history, to understand where we're coming from. When we're using let's say we're using CBT, well, what's the history of that, right?
What does that?
I think that's
what does that mean?
Yeah.
What does that mean outside of itself, right? Like, we understand what CBT means
outside of itself
from inside CBT, right?
Yes.
But what is CBT in a broader way? Like, I think that the metaphor that I would want to use is that, like, the overall discipline of psychotherapy is like this massive forest of trees, right? And, there's different species of trees which represent the different modalities, but some of them are evolved from other trees in the forest, and some of them come from, other origins entirely. They interact in unique and interesting ways. There's a whole ecology, I think is just what I'm saying, right? There's a whole sort of ecology, a set of interconnected relationships, and there's sort of unique similarities, and certain therapies thrive on certain type of conditions and things like that. But we're not given the ecology when we learn about psychotherapy. Basically, a professor hands us a tray of leaves, and goes, these are the therapies. This is psychotherapy. Psychotherapy is a tray of leaves, and pick which leaf you like the most, and then that's the one that you'll do your whole life. And there's just no attention paid to where those leaves came from, how they grew, the conditions that they grew in. This is the meaning, right? What does it mean to do CBT, right?
I love that metaphor. Yeah, why are these leaves the color and pattern that they are? Yeah, it's all disconnected. Yeah, it's basically students are given an education that locates psychology really just in the present, or as if all of these wonderful, or maybe not so wonderful, but all of these ideas just emerged out of nowhere, tabula rasa, in the last 50 to 100 years, and that's it. Yeah. Oh my gosh, it's so limited. And also, as you said before, the guruism, these are the gurus that we hold to. And then how often are we talking about R.D. Laing? How often are we talking about Cushman? How often are we talking about next to nothing, right? Female therapists, Anna Freud, so limited, right? Many are limited. Yeah.
Slow down, Richard. Yeah. There's a lot of prominent female therapists, especially nowadays.
There is, but I think
the men get a lot of credit. Don't get me wrong.
The men get a lot of credit, especially in the early formation.
Sure.
I mean, in the last 100 years, right? Obviously, we're talking about Sujat, so we're talking about But
Diana Fascia.
especially people that are, yeah, absolutely. But people,
Yeah.
I think the founders or the proponents of critical psychotherapy in particular, right? Or indigenous psychologists, other Croatian, other country, right? It doesn't get, they don't get included. Even Russian, right? There's so many advanced, interesting theories, right? When we're looking at Vygotsky and we're looking at other types of therapists from these other areas, right? Because most of our textbooks, let's be honest, right? They're coming from, a lot of them are, the state dominates, right? Like the United States in particular,
that's right.
dominates in the textbook industry. So,
yeah. I know, like having studied Soviet psychology, for instance, like it was implicit in Soviet psychology that one's psychology cannot be separated from one's culture. Like Soviet psychology was inherently Marxist, and, like the Marxist position was to understand like all psychological life as culturally and historically embedded, right? And materially embedded as well. And so, but not material in the sense of like the brain stuff, but just material in the sense of like the real conditions of one's life. For them, it's very, very normal. But for us, this idea that psychotherapy is a cultural practice, that we could think about our psychotherapy not as just what it is, the taken for granted practice that we might find ourselves engaging in, but that it's a cultural practice. It's embedded within a particular cultural and historical context. It suits a particular time, like Cushman so wonderfully articulated, right? Like psychotherapy is only meaningful, or is meaningful in particular ways in North America and the West, right? We don't think about that. And I feel like that's, Dell does labor the point of, he's like right there with Cushman, sort of laboring the idea of understanding psychotherapy as a cultural practice. And I feel like if we start from that position, it radically changes the way we think about psychotherapy. And I think that psychotherapy can still be done in a way that is like very meaningful and helpful to people, but it does change the way we think about how we do our work. And it would give us pause, right? About some of the ways that psychotherapy is practiced, especially when we think about the state's influence. So I think he's onto something. I think this Del Loewenthal guy, he's onto something. So we need that in education. We need, we should have this textbook no, I'm just kidding. In all of our, but it would be great for students to be exposed to someone like Dell or Cushman, or there's numerous other authors that write in this direction, I think, and it would be helpful. I came across in grad school, just because I was interested in it, this idea of the general theory of psychotherapy. So this is just sort of an interesting aside, but there are people who are trying to think about psychotherapy meta-theoretically, or sort of trans-theoretically, I think in this case. They're trying to get an understanding of what psychotherapy is in general, if we don't take any particular modality. And I think that's kind of an interesting and maybe noble endeavor, right? I didn't, really explore the research around that too much, but I just thought it was kind of interesting. And they had sort of like this general model of, I think it kind of similar to Bruce Wampold, who is also trying to do that, right? He's trying to find something more general, non-modal in terms of how we talk about and engage around psychotherapy. Yeah, so I think Loewenthal's got a really good quote which sort of ties this all together. So I'll read that for our listeners now. It is hoped that one outcome will be to encourage readers to consider their modality, whatever it is, also as an exercise of power, and wonder about the use of, often so-called, science in the pursuit of vested interests, notions of progress and authority. Yeah, so here Loewenthal is asking us to consider our modality as an exercise of power, not necessarily just as something good that we're offering to the patient, right? But as a kind of a political experience, right? An experience centered around a power imbalance, and one where we're expressing a certain type of power towards a certain type of interest. And we might ask what those interests are. And we might ask why those are the interests and not other interests, right? Because I feel like for counselors and psychotherapists, the first point is a little bit easier, because I think that our ethical education, at least for counselors, and I know that psychologists, psychiatrists might have a kind of different experience, I'm not sure. I know in my program, Linda loved to sort of dunk on psychologists a little bit. She was like, counselors, no, our ethics are really solid. And my ethics class was awesome. I think Linda did an amazing job. But she was like, those psychologists, though, she's like, those are the ones that, you got to watch out for. But I think we do, I think, if I throw a stone at the average counselor, they're probably going to, be able to understand, oh yeah, I have to be mindful and careful of the kind of interventions I bring to the table and make sure that they feel appropriate and acceptable to the client. And I appreciate that there's a power imbalance, and I appreciate that I have some influence, and that can be for good or not, right? So I think most of us are kind of fine in that situation. But I feel like it's the second point in this quote that's a little bit more difficult to understand, that science isn't, this objective pursuit of knowledge that we claim it is, right? That our scientific knowledge is embedded in this cultural and political framework, that sort of suits the state, right? We don't just research things to understand them. We research things with the aim of supporting the goals of the state, right? And it's really hard for us to think of science as culture, as producing kind of knowledge products rather than knowledge itself. Because I think that especially in psychology, we're trained to believe that the kind of scientific process that we're engaged in is an objective one. But I think that there's plenty of arguments, especially in the social sciences, to argue that we're not creating anything objective, that we can't extrapolate. Like as Cushman and Anthony would say, no one has a view from nowhere, right? Like everyone's already standing in a cultural situation. So like the practice of science is ultimately still a cultural one. I griped on this earlier, so I'll just say a little bit more about this, like the idea that this is already something that is understood to be a problem in psychological science. I've mentioned it a couple times, but like there's way smarter people than me out there who are writing from a constant, position of critical position against the practice of psychological research today. And they feel like the way that we're doing research is all wrong and that it ignores context and that it doesn't really provide us with a meaningful understanding of ourselves. And my take on this is that it's not coincidence that this is being ignored, right? I think that the infiltration of the state into the study of human psychology makes this sort of way of thinking about human psychology like precisely kind of impossible, because I think that one of the vested interests of the state is for us to not develop a robust understanding of ourselves, right? It's to not really know the true conditions which structured our subjectivity and therefore structure our suffering, right? And so I think that psychology has a vested interest in remaining this kind of like apolitical, acontextual, ahistorical science, because in doing so, it doesn't rub up against, or even it precisely continues to enact the aims of the state, which is to kind of keep us ignorant to who we really are and what's really happening for us, right? I don't know if I'm explaining that well, Richard, so let me know if it would be helpful to try to throw more thoughts at the
I think
problem.
It was quite powerful what you said. Yeah. And Cushman describes this, many other critical theorists describe this, that essentially the state does not want us to see where the sausage is made. It does not want us to see the machinery of the state, because the machinery of the state is crushing, right? It crushes all those who disagree. It crushes those who are on the margins, minorities. It benefits certain people and benefits them intergenerationally well, leaving others in poverty, purposefully, right, to do the bidding of wealthier people. So it would be, there's even some talk about like how insidious it can be, right? Like in the sense of, in one sense, the state wants homeless camps to be hidden or for people not to see that kind of suffering. But on the other stance, the other side of this too, is that maybe they do want some camps to be, like you look at the political campaign ads out of Pierre Poilievre, right? What does he show right away? It's the homeless camps, right? There's something wrong in society, right? And of course, scapegoating Justin Trudeau or whoever's in power is the easiest thing to do. Further to this point is the idea that the state wants to remind us that if you don't follow the rules of the state, look at how bad look at where you're going to go. You're going to end up on the street. You're a non-human almost, right? You'll be excluded from the privileges of society. So I think your point, it might seem very radical, but it certainly makes a lot of sense to me. I think it's a commonly repeated point by critical theorists and by honestly, those that are not in power are like, well, obviously this is what's happening, because we feel it crushing us, right? When I'm talking to my Indigenous clients, and the more intersectional, right? So a Black Indigenous client that's living in poverty, let's say, right? The more intersectional, the more I can't breathe, right? As George Floyd said, the more crushing the state is.
No, I liked your example there, Richard, of sort of like the way that, the state will pretend, for instance, like it cares or wants to understand, right? So it's like, oh yeah, homelessness, like this is a problem we need to figure out and solve. So like, let's put our best minds onto it. How do we solve it, right? But at the same time, there's this idea that, oh no, actually homelessness actually serves a kind of function to the state, right? And we want it to be visible in a way because we want people to be reminded of the consequences of not towing the line. And I think to sort of go back to like, just to say my point in another way, it's the idea of like, we want to understand homelessness, but only to a point, right? We don't actually really want to understand homelessness, because if we really understand homelessness, then we really understand capitalism and it's inherent in humanity and contradictions, and because that is what makes homelessness possible, right? It is
absolutely
the messed up way. And if we really understand that, and if people are really conscious of that, then the system cannot hold. It will not stay the way that it is. And so
and we'd have to change. Certain people would lose power. This is very scary to the state.
Yeah. I think it's not coincidence that we stay connected to these theories of, say, psychological suffering that are acontextual, ahistorical, apersonal, right? Is because they don't pose any risk to the state, right? If I say, oh, you're depressed because you have a chemical imbalance, that poses zero risk to the state. And in fact, that's good for the state because we've got a product for that, right? We've got a cure for that, or a treatment at least, which is depression, right? But even, some of the psychological principles that we have, it's like, okay, problem maintaining circles, right? This is a concept that I saw floating around not that long ago, kind of in cognitive science, right? Or like connected to cognitive behavioral therapy. This idea that, we get into, part of what is operative in, say, psychological disorders or clinical psychological phenomena, right? Something that might need the treatment of a therapist, is that we sort of get into a circle, there's sort of a maintenance function of that circle. So I sort of feel depressed, because, life is hard or whatever. And then because I'm depressed, I just lay on the couch and do nothing all day. And because I did nothing all day, I continue to feel non-productive, and then I don't feel good anymore. And so our intervention would be to break the circle. And it's like, well, that's fine, but it's like none of that is really looking at what drives the depression. It's just looking at what maintains it, right? Like, how did I get depressed in the first place? And if we really understand that, what would that mean? So that's kind of low risk too, right? Like all of this is sort of low risk. And so I think it's just not coincidence, that we have a hard time understanding science as something captured by the state, right? Because I think that the state wants us to see it as we're producing an objective understanding, precisely because the objective understanding that we produce creates no risk of challenging the authority or the positions of the state. There it is.
Boom. Drop the mic.
Big take. Yeah, big take. Well, you got another big take, Richard?
So in my take, looking at critical psychotherapy, it's a rich tradition. We can look at a few different philosophies as possible avenues that we could follow to better the field, right? We can look at some of these different ideas that might be more in recent history in the last 50 to 100 years, all the way back to ancient Greek tradition. So Loewenthal talks about a few. So one is the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School focuses on a sociolinguistic, sociocultural frame. So this idea that we need to make some fundamental changes to the language we use in order to think outside the ideology that has imprisoned us. Zaz, another particular view that could enrich our work in critical psychotherapy, is the anti-psychiatry movement. There's also, studying a little bit further, Del doesn't mention this, but a rich tradition of kind of anti-psychiatry in Latin America. So a lot of Europeans headed over to Latin America, but also it took its own form with some different focuses. Zaz has kind of a more libertarian view. There's the Greek tradition, the skeptical tradition from the Greeks, stressing the importance of ordinary, non-technical language, so being kind of skeptical about everything, using critical thought towards ideas that might be otherwise accepted as common sense. And just looking at other populations, even ways of understanding things, such as queer theory, literary criticism, cultural and emotional critiques, different ways of understanding and different ways of knowing. So a more emotion way of knowing, a more somatic way of knowing. These could provide alternatives to what the dominant discourse in society would be. So Dell argues, and I would agree with this, that the education of the therapist must be expanded to not read only within our field, which currently emphasizes theories and gurus that match the dominant medical model paradigm. So to be well read in culture, philosophy, different forms of religion, spirituality, this will help us have a more critical view, not just theories of psychology 101 textbook.
Yeah.
So what do you think, Glenn?
No, I like that a lot, Richard. I do. First of all, I'll say it's lovely that Dell sort of gives us a menu.
I like
feels
that. Yeah. It's a good start.
Really good to me.
It's a good start.
Because we're sort of you and I have had several discussions just talking about how do we make critical psychotherapy applicable, or and I feel like he's providing some indication of that, right? Just these are the numerous ways that we can engage in criticism, and sort of that we have to try to maneuver into in order to be effectively critical, right? Because there's sort of the basic problem problem of like, you can't really criticize the dominant ideology when you're standing within it or when you're using the concepts embedded in it. Isn't there that idea of sort of the master's house and the master's tools?
Yeah, the master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a lovely, succinct way of sort of saying it. So I appreciate the menu. Right away for me, I feel connected to the idea, like sort of the thinking in the Frankfurt School, the sort of sociolinguistic, sociocultural, the idea of like getting into language that's sort of outside of the dominant frame. This is why I was sort of bringing in this idea of an understanding, like coming to an understanding earlier, because I think that coming to an understanding is like a linguistic concept that is not embedded in, or at least it's not part of the dominant ideology of psychotherapy the way we think about it. We often think about psychotherapy as in the concept of interventions. We think about psychotherapy modally, right? But the idea of coming to an understanding is a transmodal concept. I borrow it from existential analysis because that's where I've recently been exposed to it. But it's sort of the idea of we need a phenomenological understanding. Like we need an understanding of the lived experience of the person in front of us in order to make sense of how to conduct our psychotherapy. I emphasize the concept of coming to an understanding or psychotherapy based on an understanding precisely because it offers us a different way of thinking about psychotherapy than this modal intervention-based way that we think about it, right? And coming to an understanding is a concept that's embedded in a lot of different modalities, right? It's embedded in like an existential frame, a psychoanalytic frame, psychodynamic frame, somatic frame. There's so many different types of psychotherapy that predicate themselves on the idea of an understanding, right? And so it's a concept that really ties together something meaningful in the context of psychotherapy. But it's like coming to an understanding is not something that it's not a concept that we're exposed to in our coursework, for instance. Like it's not something that we would be, we get taught all these other concepts as part of the dominant ideology of psychotherapy that lead us to a certain type of thinking, right? So I hope that made sense. This idea of, we need language, we need concepts outside of that framing in order to think critically about psychotherapy.
So in another way of saying it, that the goal of therapy should be for people to better understand themselves, better understand the context they are in, the things that influence their thinking, influence their behavior, and perhaps this could liberate them. Am I capturing that in some way, or?
I think so. I mean, I would be hesitant to say it as a goal, because I think that people will engage with psychotherapists for a variety of reasons, and it's not always to derive an understanding. And
but should that be our goal as therapists, to help the client understand themselves?
I think it could be if the client consents to it, obviously, right? And I think that it is hard. There are a lot of goals that clients will have where I think it is difficult to proceed on that goal without developing an understanding. And so,
fair.
Yeah, my argument is that when you develop an understanding, it provides like something that wasn't there before the understanding, right? Like in this case, if I lean into the idea of existential analysis, it provides the space for freedom, right? It just provides the space for free decision making. Once one has derived a sense of an understanding of oneself and one's inner positioning. So that would be an example. But I think in the example of like psychoanalysis, for instance, like we would take understanding as a way of treating neurosis, right? Like one could be free of neurotic suffering if one has a sufficient self-understanding of the basis of that neurosis, right? So, understanding affords us something, right? It provides something. But yeah, I don't necessarily want to say it as the goal. I like to think of it as more like we can think about psychotherapy as this process of understanding or working from an understanding. Like, so first we get an understanding, and then we work from that place of understanding. And what would it mean for psychotherapy if that's the way we practiced it versus, okay, psychotherapy is primarily about providing a product for consumption, primarily providing something for the client to do or to try or to take in that is supposed to be, make their product or their experience better or more manageable in some way.
What could be an example of something that someone comes to an understanding about?
Sure. Okay. Yeah. I'll just try to use a very, very general example, but it's like, let's say that someone comes to you and they're like, I am depressed. I can't get my life together. I can't, I can't find a job, or I can't get off the couch. I feel really bad about myself and things like that. Coming to an understanding would just be like coming to an understanding about what drives that depression and what keeps it in place and keeps it operative in a person's life. And so that could be different for different people. It would be, right? It would be necessarily different for different people. That's one of the big arguments you and I have been advancing all night, Richard, is like we can't take this general position on what drives people's experience, right?
But some of the things besides the biological view that you have a chemical imbalance could be.
Yeah, could be. Oh man, it's hard to come up with an example just because, like, I think that it's like an understanding is discovered within a person, right? And that's what makes an understanding beautiful. But maybe it's that, they're actually afraid to succeed, right? And then there's a whole exploration of the fear around success and what that means and trying to understand that, right? So that would just be a basic example, right?
Yeah, I think on that point, like there could be a cultural understanding of those in my culture that were successful would get stamped down, right?
Lovely.
So understanding, like I guess I'm trying to like. There's absolutely, it's going to be individual for everyone. There's going to be, but there is kind of maybe some, it's not this formulaic thing, but there's an understanding. There are some ingredients. I'm thinking about it kind of more as making a soup, perhaps. So having some understanding of the cultural messaging that might keep us in a suffering position, having some understanding of family dynamics, having some understanding of various things, I guess. Those are various lenses to look at oneself.
Yeah, I think it's good to have like a general sense of possible avenues you might explore or possible attributions to behavior. But I mean, we've talked about, for instance, when we practice relationally, right? Like really letting the client hit us. And I mean, that whatever they hit us with could be something really unique or different, or it can take a while to make sense of. So I think, I don't want to say this idea that we just sort of wait to be able to interpret what the client is experiencing culturally, right? Like, I'm arguing for a relational way of approaching this, but what I am saying is that taking in and letting the client hit us is part of developing an understanding, right? It's dealing with the raw data of the client's experience as they touch us, through our felt experience of them, as we listen to what they say, as they make attributions, but I think also as they omit certain attributions or, slip on certain attributions, right? Or, there's lots of different ways to derive data for an understanding. I didn't expect to talk about this so much, but this is kind of cool, I guess. Yeah. It would just be about enriching. If we use the language of Cushman, and I'm really thinking about Anthony here, I hope he listens to this episode. Shout out to you, Anthony. But this idea of a horizon of understanding, right? And moving forward on the horizon of understanding. So like, no, it was different. There was maybe the spatial metaphor that Anthony had used and maybe Cushman was using, which is like sort of like a small amount of space, or like I'm trying to remember. Anthony had this great metaphor for describing this. He really did. Yeah. To sort of use my outlier to maybe to go to narrative therapy, like the idea of like a thinly structured story versus a richly structured story, right? Like just a story that goes on narrow tracks, has few possibilities and leads, to few places, versus, when we come to a real place of understanding and really get a rich sense of, what is informing our experience, then there's lots of different avenues of exploration and lots of different possibilities that come from that. I don't know. I think I'm just getting more abstract about it, Richard, and I'm trying to get more concrete, and that's sort of funny.
I think I was definitely thinking that in a follow-up episode, being able to focus on some of the, perhaps it is some tools, right, to borrow from the quote, the master's tools, using tools that are outside of the master's house, that their cultures have, and various populations and protesters have come up with theories to help people, or some processes, let's say, right? And they're going to vary, sure, from community to community, to help us understand ourselves better, right? Psychoanalysis might be one part of that, right? Paulo Freire from Brazil, like the pedagogy of the oppressed, the theater of the oppressed, kind of enacting, street youth there are enacting the problems of society in front of them in a theater format, right? To reveal this to different classes of society, where it would be, these problems would be more hidden, participatory action, appreciative inquiry. So there's lots of things. And I would love, I think, because I feel like that it is one purpose of our podcast, is to empower our listeners with, some new, we can't manualize it, and neither would we do that. It's this manualized, very narrow view, but to take from wonderful, rich, even non-Western traditions to help people, gain more enlightenment, liberation, understanding, I think it'd be helpful. Because what I hear a lot from students and early career practitioners, and even ones that have been in the field longer, is, okay, so, I am critical of many aspects of therapy and certainly society. But how do I actually practice in that way? How do I help my clients feel empowered and move forward into action? And how do I do that myself? This is kind of one of the criticisms of maybe academia or universities. Well, okay, they're very liberal. They have all of these great ideas about how to reform society. How much activism and processes are actually happening on campuses and in our educational institutions today to actually lift up those communities, for example, or lift up the healers that we're working with to help those communities in very practical ways. It often stays in the ivory tower, right? Or stays in discussion groups or etc. So that's kind of my fear or concern. And
Yeah.
we're not going to be able to get to all of that today, but I just see it as a future jumping off point.
No, I think what you're saying is really good and really relevant, Richard. I think, like, to speak to a little bit more, I think when I use the term coming to an understanding, in a way I am talking about something radical, right? Because what I'm talking about is doing something differently than simply just providing someone with something that they can consume, right? When you come to an understanding of someone, you kind of leave them hungry, right? You don't fill the void. You ask them to turn their eye towards it, right? And that is a difficult thing to do, inherently difficult. But what it does is it allows the possibility of really looking at the hunger and understanding it, right? And then perhaps working in a way that isn't just, replicating the dynamics of consumption, right? But yeah, I mean, I think our episode on relational psychotherapy was a good example of that, of ways of approaching psychotherapy that are predicated on coming to an understanding. It might be good to try to get Anthony back and to talk more about something around like the existential frame and its approach, because I know that there's writing specifically on that. I've read it before around, trying to break its approach down a little bit more, make it more concrete. Maybe it might also be cool, Richard, for deliberating practice to start a supervision group, and to bring people in, because group supervision can be a place for deriving an understanding of oneself, right? And also working towards an understanding of one's clients as well. So, and that would be like a living space. Is that sort of what you're speaking to?
I love it because in one sense, yeah, there's a lot of education. We are getting, again, people would say, okay, well, the college campus is very liberal or radical even, but to practice something, there is a lack of knowledge around critical psychotherapy. But not only is there a lack of knowledge, right? Even if there wasn't, people need a community, right? You work this out, as you said, relationally, and you need a community to come down to apply the understanding that you're doing into different contexts. So I love your idea. Super open to that, and maybe listeners will have some feedback about that. But love it.
Yeah. We could certainly encourage anyone, if they would be interested in a supervision group, comment on the episodes or email us, let us know.
Trying to be a critical psychotherapist on your own is pretty damn lonely. I don't think it is a super effective endeavor.
No. I think what you're saying makes so much sense, Richard. I mean, we need to be able to talk through this with each other, because part of this is about coming to a different kind of understanding about psychotherapy, right? And that takes work. We're engaged in the same kind of psychological work right now that our clients or ourselves would be engaged in the therapy room, of sort of trying to figure something out that's a little bit obscure, or that, doesn't make sense right now, or that, we're sort of trapped in a specific ideological framework, and we're trying to find our way out of it into something that allows us to engage with it with more agency and understanding. And so we need other people, we need other minds to be able to do that. So I love what you're saying. Yeah, that would be a good topic for another episode too, is just like you said, how to bring some of this into practice a little bit more. We could call it practicing critically or something. I'm sort of wondering, Richard, is there more to say, or do you feel we've done Loewenthal justice? I will say a great deal of his article was just referencing some of the other authors that are in the book and providing a quick snippet of their contributions. It really was sort of an article that was a kind of cursory introduction to the book. But I think that he brought forward some interesting points, and I hope we've done them justice tonight.
Yeah, I think one other point that might come up is just around, just to emphasize what we talked about before, the importance of context. And I think one of the reasons why it's so difficult for us to be able to work our way out of the kind of neoliberal trap is, and we've mentioned this before, this idea of capitalist realism, that capitalism is always focused on what is new, right? There's this new product to consume, the iPhone 2 million and 2 million and one. In this sense, there's always a sense of newness and something, exciting and new. whatever is old, whatever has tradition, whatever has ritual is disregarded, right? It becomes not only apolitical, but like disconnected from a sense of time and tradition. So yeah, that emphasizes even more the need for people like in a community to be able to talk about this regularly, because there are the forces psychologically. Capitalism is an extremely powerful psychological force. One of the reasons why it's been globalized and spread so much, because it really does dominate and eliminate that there can be almost any other type of thinking around it, right? The most productive movements I've seen in critical psychotherapy and liberation psychologies, they talk about communities, theater troupes coming together, communes, people living together, working this out in relationship, conflicts occurring, but working it out in relationship.
Yeah, no, I love what you said there, Richard, especially around the notion of novelty, because I think that, yeah, what you're talking about, like if we keep going in the status quo way that we're going, then what's going to happen is we're just going to, keep taking our new trainings and the hot new trend in psychotherapy every 5 years, whatever it is, right? And, we're going to be in the place that we've been before, which is just thinking about psychotherapy modally. We expose ourselves to a new modality. Maybe there's something a little bit different in that, but ultimately we're sort of in the same place, which is we don't really understand psychotherapy any more than we did before we took the training, right? And what you're talking about is trying to create something enduring with some continuity that can break us out of this trend of just going to this or that thought guru and getting their hot take on the best way to do therapy, right? We're going to talk about psychotherapy in general. We're going to really derive an understanding of what the hell it is we do, as we do it. And I think that's great. I think that's the spirit of deliberating practice, is to try to be a community that creates a kind of constancy around these meta-theoretical issues in the space of psychotherapy. So
we want to understand our origins to know where we're going. There's no other way that I can think without that. So yeah, you explained some points that I was trying to get to as well. Yeah, the repeating of just what's the hot new trademarked theory of the week. That's so dangerous. That's not productive. It helps certain gurus' pocketbooks, but that's about it.
Well, yeah. And I mean, probably there's a lot of our listeners who have had this experience of you go to a training, you're excited, the concepts are cool, and then you sit in front of a patient and it doesn't work, right? And I remember Jeffrey Kotler saying this exact thing, right? In one of the talks that he gave, which was like, it's sort of baffling in some ways that we get so excited. But what he was speaking about, I think, was just to the fact that psychotherapy is often less exciting than we make it out to be, right? And these trainings always use their best case examples, and it speaks to the need for us, again, to always work with the person in front of us first, right? Modality is, it's second to the person in front of us. Again, what would it mean if we ditch this way of, approaching people where we worked from a place of explanation and instead try to work from a place of understanding?
I love that.
That's my take.
Maybe that's a great place to end.
Yeah. Well, and so to say a couple more, because we're sort of talking into this, like, episode 10 is a great place for us to maybe talk about our hopes for the future, which is to expand deliberating practice beyond a podcast, for it to be kind of a community of practice, to bring listeners in and enhance engagement. So, Richard, you and I, we talked about the idea of a supervision group, which I think would just be so beautiful. And I think we've also talked about the idea of like a book club, and maybe, trying to engage listeners around, like to host informal book club meetings where we can talk about the listener or the literature with other listeners, and then maybe more, we'd find other interesting ways to engage people, live streaming or something like that. So episode 10 sort of marks the end of the beginning in some ways, and maybe the beginning of, not the end, but of a new beginning, right? Of a new beginning of, additional ways we want to just engage listeners and reach out and develop what we're trying to do with this project. So stay tuned, for some exciting things in 2025.
Thank you, Glenn.
Yeah. Thank you, Richard. Wonderful to talk to you tonight. Take care.
We hope you enjoyed the podcast and are a little wiser for it.
Thanks for listening.